The first time Elena Moretti threw up at the breakfast table, 12 armed men reached for their guns, not because anyone thought she was being poisoned, because across the length of a black marble dining table, her husband went completely still. Dante Valenti did not move often without purpose. Men had been killed for misreading the slightest shift in his expression, and entire crews had changed allegiance after a single quiet phone call from him. He was 34, controlled half the docks on Chicago's South Side, owned nightclubs that never closed, construction companies that never lost bids, and enough secrets about judges, detectives, and aldermen to make powerful men lower their voices when they said his name. But that morning, his face emptied of everything. Elena barely made it to the silver bowl of oranges before nausea climbed through her throat again. She pressed a hand to her mouth and stumbled away from the table. Dante's chair scraped behind her. His mother, Vittoria Valenti, whispered, "No." His uncle Carlo stopped chewing, and Matteo Rizzo, Dante's consigliere, looked toward the windows as if a sniper had just appeared outside. Elena made it 3 steps before Dante caught her by the waist. "Don't touch me," she breathed, humiliated and dizzy. He ignored the command, one hand firm around her ribs while the other brushed her hair away from her face. The gesture was so unexpectedly gentle that it frightened her more than anger would have. "How long?" he asked. "What?" His voice dropped. "How long have you been sick in the morning?" Every person at the table seemed to stop breathing. Elena stared at him. Then she understood. Her own blood turned cold. 3 months earlier, on the night she had been forced to marry Dante Valenti, he had told her one fact with absolute certainty. He could never father a child. He had not said it with shame. He had said it like a warning carved into stone. There will be no heir, no nursery, no expectations. You will never owe me a child. At the time, Elena had been grateful for the only mercy in a marriage she had never chosen. Now Dante's hand tightened at her waist. His eyes, black and unreadable, lowered toward her stomach. Across the room, his uncle Carlo slowly set down his coffee. "Dante," he said too softly, "if she is pregnant, then we have a problem." Dante looked up. The warmth vanished from his face. "No," he said, "if she's pregnant, someone else has a problem." The silence that followed was more terrifying than gunfire. Elena pulled out of his grip. "I'm not pregnant." Vittoria crossed herself. Carlo gave a thin smile. "Then prove it." Dante turned his head. He did not raise his voice. "Say that to my wife again." Carlo's smile disappeared. The men around the table looked down. Elena hated that word. Wife. 3 months earlier, it had sounded like a sentence. Now, standing in a mansion full of armed men who believed she might be carrying an impossible child, it sounded like a target painted over her heart. And for the first time since she had married the most feared man in Chicago, Elena realized something worse than being trapped inside his world. Someone inside that world wanted the truth about her body badly enough to kill for it. 3 months before the morning sickness, Elena Moretti's life had been ordinary in all the ways she treasured. She worked as an emergency room nurse at St. Catherine's Medical Center. She rented a small apartment above a bakery in Bridgeport, drove a 10-year-old Honda with a cracked taillight, and spent Sunday evenings eating pasta with her younger brother Luca, while pretending their family was not slowly drowning in debts left behind by their father. Elena was 26 and had become skilled at surviving emergencies, gunshot wounds, car crashes, overdoses, panicked relatives. Drunk men shouting at nurses. She could stop bleeding, start IVs, argue with surgeons, and tell a frightened child exactly where to look while a needle went in. What she could not fix was the name Moretti. Her father, Salvatore, had once owned 3 restaurants and enough gambling debt to destroy all of them. By the time cancer took him, he had borrowed money from men who did not send invoices. Elena had spent 2 years selling what remained, negotiating with creditors, and keeping Luca out of trouble. She thought the worst was over. Then, one rainy November night, she walked out of St. Catherine's after a 14-hour shift and found 3 black SUVs blocking the employee parking lot. Every nurse beside her stopped talking. A man in a charcoal coat stood beneath the awning. He was tall, broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, and motionless in a way that made everyone else seem nervous. Rain silvered the pavement behind him. 2 armed men waited several steps back. Elena recognized him immediately. Everyone in Chicago did. Dante Valenti. There were no confirmed photographs of him committing crimes. There were no convictions. There were only stories. A bookmaker who disappeared after threatening Dante's sister, a union boss who suddenly sold his lake house and moved to Arizona, a Russian crew found tied to chairs in an abandoned warehouse after trying to take Valenti territory, and a federal task force that had spent 6 years trying to put Dante behind bars without ever getting close. Elena kept walking. One of the nurses grabbed her sleeve. "Elena," she whispered, "don't. My car's over there." "So is Satan." Dante heard her. His mouth almost moved. Almost. Elena stopped 10 feet away. "You're blocking my car." His men stared at her as though she had slapped him. Dante looked past her at the battered Honda. "That one? Unfortunately. You should replace the taillight. You should move your SUVs." For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Then Dante lifted 2 fingers. All 3 vehicles backed away. Elena blinked. "Thank you." She walked toward her car. Elena Moretti. Her hand froze on the door handle. She turned. He knew her name. Dante stepped into the rain. "We need to talk about your brother." Fear cut through her exhaustion. What did Luca do? Nothing yet? That's not an answer. He owes $40,000 to a man named Nicky Falco. Falco works for my uncle. Your brother borrowed to cover your father's old markers, then doubled the debt betting on sports. Elena felt the parking lot tilt. "You're lying." Dante held out a phone. On the screen was a photograph of Luca leaving a betting room Elena had begged him never to enter. The timestamp was from 2 nights earlier. Her stomach dropped. "Where is he?" "Safe." "What does that mean?" "It means Falco hasn't broken his hands because I told him not to." Elena stepped closer. "Why would you care?" Dante's gaze did not leave her face. "Because your father owed my father a different kind of debt." She laughed once without humor. "Of course he did. Come with me." "No." His men shifted. Dante did not. "You misunderstand." "No, I understand exactly. A man with armed bodyguards shows up outside my job and tells me to get in his car. That's called kidnapping." "If I were kidnapping you, Elena, you would already be in the car." The calm way he said it made her skin prickle. "Then what are you doing?" "Offering you a choice before other people remove it." She should have walked away. Instead, she looked at the photograph of her brother again. 20 minutes later, she sat inside Dante Valenti's armored SUV, watching rain race down tinted windows while the city she knew disappeared behind her. Dante said almost nothing during the drive. That silence became its own form of pressure. When they reached a private mansion on Lake Michigan, Elena expected gold, marble, and men trying too hard to look rich. Instead, the Valenti estate was quiet, old, and severe. Dark stone, tall windows, security cameras tucked beneath copper gutters, a black iron gate thick enough to stop a truck. Inside, family portraits lined a corridor lit by low amber lamps. Dante led her into a library where an older woman waited beside the fireplace, Vittoria Valenti. Elena knew the face from charity galas and society pages, the widow of Angelo Valenti, mother of Dante and his younger sister Sophia. Vittoria studied Elena from head to toe. "She has her mother's eyes," she said. Elena stiffened. "You knew my mother?" "Sit down." "I'd rather stand." Vittoria's expression sharpened with approval. Dante remained by the door. Vittoria opened an old leather folder and slid a document across the desk. It was a contract, 27 years old, signed by Angelo Valenti and Salvatore Moretti. Elena read the first page, then the second. Her pulse accelerated. Her father had not merely borrowed money. Years earlier, he had helped Angelo Valenti hide funds during a federal investigation. In exchange, Angelo had guaranteed the Moretti family's safety and invested secretly in Salvatore's first restaurant. Then came another clause, a promise between families. If the Valenti leadership ever faced an inheritance challenge, a marriage between the families could be used to preserve the alliance and protect both bloodlines. Elena looked up slowly. "This is insane." Dante's voice came from behind her. "Agreed." "Then burn it." "I tried." She turned. For the first time, something like anger appeared in his face. "My father filed copies with 3 attorneys and a private trust. My uncle Carlo found one after my father died." Vittoria folded her hands. "The families are dividing. Carlo has been telling our captains that Dante has no future because he cannot produce an heir." Elena looked between them. "What does any of that have to do with me?" Vittoria answered. "If Dante marries outside the organization, Carlo loses the argument that he has abandoned tradition. If he marries the daughter of the family named in Angelo's compact, several old captains who are currently neutral will remain loyal." Elena stared at Dante. "You're asking me to marry you because your employees are having a succession crisis?" "I'm not asking," Vittoria said. Dante's eyes cut toward his mother. The room chilled. Elena rose. "Then I'm leaving." She made it 2 steps before Vittoria said, "Falco will collect Luca's debt by tomorrow night." Elena stopped. "You said he was safe." Dante's jaw tightened. "He is under my protection." "And if I say no?" Dante did not answer immediately. That pause told her enough. She crossed the room and slapped him. The sound cracked through the library. One of the guards outside moved. Dante lifted a hand without looking away from her. The guard froze. Elena's palm burned. "You don't get to turn my brother into leverage. I didn't create his debt." "You're using it." "Yes." The honesty stunned her. He stepped closer. "I could lie to you. I could tell you this is about honor, family, or some promise made by dead men. It isn't. I need stability. You need your brother alive. I can solve both problems." "By owning me?" Something moved in his eyes. "No one owns you." "That's what this is? Then write your conditions." Elena laughed. "Conditions? Separate bedroom. Your job. Your money. Your name. Your freedom to leave the estate with security, no children, no expectation that you become involved in my business. 1 year, after that, if the political situation is stable, we divorce." She stared at him. No children? Dante's expression changed almost imperceptibly. He looked toward the fire. I can't have them. There was no invitation in the statement, no request for sympathy, just fact. Doctors? Elena asked. 3. You're sure? He looked back at her. Completely. That should not have mattered, but it did. One fear vanished from the arrangement. Another replaced it. What happens to Luca's debt? Gone. Not transferred to you? Gone. And he gets out of gambling rooms permanently. I'll make certain of it. You won't hurt him. Unless he gives me a reason. Dante. He held her gaze. Fine. She hated that she was considering it. She hated her father. She hated Luca. She hated every man who had ever signed a woman's future onto paper and called it family duty. Most of all, she hated that the dangerous man in front of her was the only one offering terms she could negotiate. 1 year, she said. Dante's face became unreadable again. 1 year. 6 days later, Elena married Dante beneath the stone arches of St. Michael's while freezing rain swept across Chicago and black SUVs surrounded the church. She wore ivory. He wore black. When tires screamed outside during the vows, every armed man reached beneath his coat, and Dante moved in front of Elena before anyone knew whether there was danger. It was only a drunk driver, but she never forgot the instinctive way he shielded her. That night, at the mansion, he showed her the lock on her bedroom door, placed a private bank card in her name on the dresser, and reminded her that 1 year was still the agreement. He never asked to enter her room. For the first 2 weeks, their marriage became an armed truce. Elena returned to St. Catherine's with a security detail that embarrassed her, infuriated her co-workers, and terrified every man who tried to flirt with her. Dante left before sunrise and often returned after midnight. They crossed paths in hallways, at breakfast, or in the library. He asked about her shifts. She refused to ask about his. He never entered her bedroom without permission. She never entered his office at all. A month into the marriage, someone tried to kill her. It happened outside St. Catherine's at dusk. Elena had just finished a shift when a delivery van jumped the curb. She heard tires scream. A body hit her from the side. She crashed onto wet pavement as the van slammed into a concrete planter exactly where she had been standing. Before she could breathe, gunfire erupted. Her security detail dragged her behind an SUV. People screamed. Glass exploded across the entrance. Elena covered her head. Then Dante was there. She never knew how he arrived so quickly. 1 second, there were guards around her. The next, Dante stepped into the open rain with a pistol in his hand, firing twice toward the van. Dante! He ignored her. Another shot cracked. He moved back behind the SUV and crouched in front of her. His coat was open. Rain ran down his face. Are you hit? No. His hands moved over her shoulders, arms, waist, checking for blood. I'm fine. Look at me. I am. Look at me. She understood then. He was afraid. Not visibly. Not in any way another person might notice, but Elena had spent years recognizing fear beneath anger in emergency rooms. Dante Valenti was terrified. I'm fine, she repeated softly. His hands stopped. Their faces were inches apart. A guard shouted that the shooter was down. Dante stood. The fear disappeared. What replaced it was worse. He walked toward the van. Elena grabbed his wrist. Don't. He looked at her hand. He tried to kill you. The police are coming. That has never stopped me before. Maybe it should. Rain fell between them. His jaw flexed. Then, astonishingly, Dante handed his gun to Matteo. Take her home. You're coming too, Elena said. He stared at her. That sounded like an order. You're learning. He came home. That night, 50 armed men arrived at the estate. Elena watched from the staircase as captains filled the library and hallways. Voices rose, names were exchanged, territory, routes, debts, betrayals. She should have gone upstairs. Instead, she heard one phrase through the half-closed library doors. "Carlo thinks she makes you weak." Dante answered, "Then Carlo is free to test that theory." Silence. Another man said, "If she dies, the marriage alliance dies with her." Dante's voice became almost gentle. "If Elena dies, alliances will be the least of your problems." She backed away before anyone saw her. For the first time, she understood that his protectiveness was no longer political. That frightened her. The realization frightened Dante, too. Over the next several weeks, he became more distant. He stopped eating breakfast with her, stopped appearing in the library late at night, stopped asking about her shifts. Security doubled. Her freedom shrank while his presence disappeared. Elena finally cornered him in the garage one evening as he prepared to leave. "Are you avoiding me?" Dante buttoned his coat. "No. You're terrible at lying for someone who supposedly runs organized crime. Go inside. There. That. You keep telling me where to go instead of speaking to me." His eyes darkened. "Because every conversation with you becomes an argument. Maybe because you make decisions about my life without asking. Someone tried to put 3 bullets into you. And now I'm guarded in the shower. There is nobody in your shower. That is not the point." He stepped closer. "You want the point? Here it is. The man who ordered that attack has not been found. Until he is, you do not walk through this city alone. I'm not one of your soldiers." "No." His voice dropped. "You're the one person I can't replace." The words landed between them. Dante looked as if he regretted them immediately. Elena forgot what she had been about to say. A black sedan idled behind him. Snow began to fall beyond the garage doors. "Dante." He turned away. "Go inside." This time she did, but nothing felt the same afterward. The first time Elena kissed him, it was an accident born from fear. At least that was what she told herself later. The estate lost power during a February storm. Backup generators kicked in within seconds, but something triggered the security alarms before they did. Elena woke to darkness and footsteps. Her bedroom door opened. She grabbed the lamp beside her bed. "Elena!" "Dante." She lowered the lamp. He crossed the room and pulled her behind him just as glass shattered downstairs. Gunfire erupted in the courtyard. "What is happening?" "Stay behind me." "Dante, behind me." He moved her through a hidden door in the wardrobe into a narrow stone passage. Emergency lights glowed red along the floor. Matteo met them at the end. "South wall breach. 3 men, maybe more." "Carlo?" Dante asked. "Unknown." Dante pushed Elena toward Matteo. "Take her to the safe room." She grabbed his coat. "You're not leaving me." His eyes locked on hers. Another burst of gunfire echoed. "Elena!" "No. This is not the hospital. You don't get to argue with me here." "You promised 1 year. You don't get killed after 2 months." Something fierce passed through his expression. Then he touched her face, actually touched her. His gloved hand cupped her cheek. "I am coming back." "You don't know that." "I do." "How?" "Because you just gave me a reason." He left. The safe room had steel walls, surveillance monitors, medical supplies, and no windows. Elena watched gunmen move through snow on the screens. 10 minutes later, one camera showed Dante crossing the courtyard beneath falling snow. A shooter appeared behind him. Elena screamed at a monitor he could not hear. Dante turned at the last second and fired. The shooter fell. Then another man rushed him. They disappeared beyond the camera. Elena could not breathe. 5 minutes passed, then 10. When the steel door finally opened, Dante stood there with blood on his jaw. Elena crossed the room before she thought. She hit his chest once. "You took forever." "It was 12 minutes. "That's forever when people are shooting at you." "I'm fine." "You're bleeding." "Not mine." She stared at him. Then she grabbed his coat and kissed him. Dante froze. For one terrible second, Elena thought he would push her away. Instead, his hand slid to the back of her neck. The kiss deepened, not rough, not rushed, but controlled with the same dangerous restraint he used in everything else. It felt like standing too close to a fire and realizing you had wanted the heat all along. Elena pulled back first. Dante's forehead rested against hers. Neither spoke. Matteo cleared his throat from the doorway. "I can come back." Elena jumped away. Dante closed his eyes briefly. "You should." Matteo disappeared. Elena wiped her mouth, suddenly unable to look at Dante. That shouldn't have happened. No. Her chest tightened. Then he added, "But I'm glad it did." That was how the rules began to die. Not all at once, slowly. A hand at the small of her back during dinner, coffee waiting beside her medical journals, late-night conversations in the library, a kiss in the pantry when Sophia almost walked in, Dante standing in Elena's doorway one night and asking quietly, "May I?" The question mattered more than anything that happened after it. By the end of the 3rd month, their separate bedrooms were mostly ceremonial, and Elena had made the mistake of forgetting that every tender thing inside the Valenti mansion existed under the shadow of violence. The morning sickness began on a Tuesday. At first, she blamed hospital coffee, then stress, then a stomach virus. By Friday, the smell of eggs sent her running from breakfast. Sophia followed her into the bathroom. "Okay," Sophia said, closing the door. "I am not a doctor, but I have watched enough television to ask an obvious question." Elena looked at her reflection. Pale skin, wide eyes. "No." "When was your last period?" Elena's heart began pounding. She counted backward, then counted again. 6 weeks. "No," she repeated. Sophia's expression changed. "Elena, he can't have children." "Are you sure?" 3 doctors. He told me. Everyone knows. It's why Carlo thinks Adrian should inherit. Sophia leaned against the sink. "Doctors can be wrong." "Not 3 of them." "Then take a test." Elena looked toward the closed door. "If anyone sees me buy one, I'll get it." "Sophia, I'm the Mafia princess. If anyone asks, I'm buying it for myself and then threatening them until they forget." Despite everything, Elena laughed. 2 hours later, Sophia returned with 6 different pregnancy tests hidden inside a designer shopping bag beneath a pair of shoes. Elena took 3, all positive. She sat on the bathroom floor staring at them. Sophia sat beside her. Neither spoke. Finally, Elena whispered, "He's going to think I cheated." "Did you?" Elena turned sharply. "No." "Then don't look guilty." "Sophia, this is medically impossible. Apparently your uterus didn't get the memo." Elena covered her face. Her first emotion should have been joy. Instead, it was fear. Not fear of Dante hurting her. Somewhere along the way, she had stopped believing he ever would. She was afraid of what this pregnancy would do to him, to the family, to the succession fight, and beneath all of it was a smaller, more painful fear. What if the test was wrong? What if she allowed herself to want this impossible child and lost it before she understood what it meant? She decided to tell Dante privately that night. She never got the chance. At breakfast the next morning, nausea hit before she could leave the room, and every person at the table understood at once. "Then prove it," Carlo said. Dante's warning came colder than winter. "Say that to my wife again." Carlo leaned back. "We all know the facts. Dante, you cannot father a child. If Elena is pregnant, either the tests are wrong or your marriage is not what you claim." Adrian looked uncomfortable. Vittoria whispered, "Enough." Elena straightened. "I am pregnant." The room erupted. One captain swore. Another stood. Vittoria covered her mouth. Dante did not move. Elena looked only at him. "I found out yesterday. I was going to tell you tonight." His voice was almost inaudible. "Is it mine?" Pain struck harder than she expected. She had known he would ask. Still, the question cut. "Yes." Carlo laughed once. Dante turned toward him. "Leave." "Dante, everyone out." Nobody argued. Within seconds, the room emptied except for Elena and Dante. He stood at the far end of the table. She stood near the windows. 20 feet between them felt like miles. "3 specialists," he said. "I know." "Tests over 11 years." "I know." "0 viable sperm. Every time." Elena swallowed. "Then the tests were wrong." His face tightened. "Were they?" She stared at him. "So if you think I slept with someone else, say it." "I asked you a question." "And I answered." "I need certainty." "So do I." He looked away. That hurt more than anything. Elena's eyes burned. "You know me." Dante's gaze returned. "I know what I feel about you. That is not the same as evidence." She recoiled as if slapped. He realized immediately what he had said. "Elena, don't. Listen to me." "No. You listen. I married you because I was forced into a corner. I stayed because I chose to. I trusted you because you gave me reasons to. I climbed into your bed because I wanted you. Not your name, not your money, you." Her voice broke. Dante's face changed. "And now I'm pregnant with your child, and the first thing you want is evidence. Because if this is mine, then someone lied to me for more than a decade." Elena froze. Dante stepped closer. "Do you understand what that means?" She did. The anger shifted. 3 doctors. 11 years. A succession crisis built around his supposed infertility. Carlo pushing Adrian as the future heir. An attack on Elena after the marriage. The pieces moved inside her mind. "You think someone falsified your diagnosis?" "I think I don't know what to think." "Then find out." "I will." "And until you do?" His eyes dropped to her stomach. When he answered, the words were stripped bare. "Until I do, no one gets near you." Elena's anger returned. "That sounds like a prison sentence. It sounds like survival." "I am still going to work." "No." "Dante. Someone tried to kill you before there was an heir involved. If this child is mine, every man who benefits from my bloodline ending now has a reason to kill both of you. You don't get to lock me away. Watch me." She picked up a coffee cup and threw it at the wall beside his head. It shattered. Dante didn't flinch. "I hate you." "No, you don't." "At this exact moment, I am willing to explore it." For the first time that morning, a trace of warmth entered his eyes. Then it vanished. "Pack a bag." "Why?" "Because this house is compromised." The safe house sat on a frozen stretch of Lake Michigan 2 hours north of the city. It was less a house than a glass and stone fortress hidden behind pine trees and electronic gates. Dante brought 6 guards, Matteo, Elena, and a private obstetrician named Dr. Claire Mason. Elena objected to the doctor until Claire introduced herself by saying, "I don't work for your husband. I work for whoever is pregnant. If he annoys me, I will throw him out." Elena liked her immediately. Dante did not. The ultrasound happened that afternoon. Elena lay on an exam table in a converted bedroom while Dante stood by the window, arms crossed. He had not touched her since breakfast. Claire moved the probe and watched the monitor. "There," she said. A tiny flicker appeared. Elena stopped breathing. "Is that heartbeat?" The room changed. Elena looked toward Dante. He had gone completely still. Claire turned up the sound. Rapid beats filled the silence. Dante's face lost all color. He stepped closer to the monitor. "That's real?" Claire glanced at him. "Generally, I don't fake fetal heart activity for dramatic effect." Elena almost laughed through her tears. Dante did not. He stared at the screen like a man seeing a ghost. Claire printed an image and handed it to Elena. "On 6 weeks and 4 days. Everything looks where it should be." Elena looked down at the tiny shape. When she lifted her eyes, Dante was still watching. "Do you want to see?" she asked. His gaze moved to her face. Something inside him seemed to fracture. He crossed the room and took the image. His fingers trembled. Only once. Then he closed his hand around the edge of the photograph like it was the most dangerous thing he had ever held. That night, Elena found him outside on the deck in freezing wind. No coat, no guards close enough to hear. She opened the glass door. "Are you trying to get pneumonia? Go inside. You love saying that." He didn't answer. Elena wrapped a blanket around herself and stepped beside him. The lake was black beneath the moon. "You still think I cheated?" Dante's jaw tightened. "No." The answer came fast enough to surprise her. "What changed?" "The dates." "Very romantic." "You were under constant protection during that period. I reviewed every movement." Elena stared. "You reviewed my movements?" "I was angry." "That is deeply creepy." "I know." She waited. "And?" He looked down at the ultrasound photograph in his hand. He had carried it outside. "And I know you." Her chest tightened. "You could have started with that." "I'm not good at starting with what matters. I've noticed." He turned toward her. "I'm sorry." Elena had never heard him say those words. Not to anyone. The wind moved through the pines. "For doubting me?" "For making you stand alone in that room when you were scared." Her anger softened despite her effort to keep it. "I was terrified." "I know." "Were you?" Dante's eyes shifted toward the dark water. "Yes." "Of the baby?" "Of wanting it." That answer nearly broke her. He looked at the ultrasound again. "I spent 11 years believing there would never be one. At first I was angry, then relieved. Children are leverage in my world. They are weaknesses men can photograph, follow, threaten. I told myself infertility made me harder to hurt." Elena touched his hand. "And now?" He looked at her. "Now there are 2 people in this world I cannot survive losing." The words were not sweet. They were frightening, because Dante said them like a confession and a threat at the same time. Elena rested her forehead against his chest. After a moment, his arms came around her. For 1 minute, the Mafia war disappeared. Then Matteo opened the door. "Dante, we found one of the doctors." The first doctor was dead. The second had moved to Switzerland 6 years earlier. The third, Dr. Aaron Feldman, lived in a gated retirement community outside Milwaukee. Dante brought him to the safe house before dawn. Elena woke to raised voices downstairs. She found Feldman sitting in the living room beneath guard watch, gray-haired and shaking. Dante stood across from him. "Tell her," Dante said. Feldman looked at Elena. "Mrs. Valenti." "Tell me what?" The doctor swallowed. "Your husband's fertility reports were altered." The room went silent. Elena looked at Dante. He was expressionless. Feldman continued. He had severe oligospermia as a teenager after an injury, very low count, poor motility, but not absolute infertility. There was always a small possibility. "Then why tell him 0?" Elena asked. Feldman's eyes filled with fear. "I was paid." Dante stepped closer. "By whom?" Feldman closed his eyes. "Carlo Valenti." Elena felt cold spread through her body. Dante did not react. That was worse. "How long?" he asked. "Your first test was legitimate. The count was extremely low. After your father died, Carlo approached me. He wanted every later test recorded as complete azoospermia. He said it was temporary, political. He said no one would be hurt." Dante laughed once. There was no humor in it. "No one would be hurt." Feldman began crying. "I was afraid." "You should have been." Elena stepped between them. Dante's gaze snapped to her. "Move." "No." "Elena, if you kill him, you lose a witness." Matteo nodded carefully. "She's right." Dante's eyes never left Elena's. "I know she's right." "Then stop looking like you're deciding whether a witness can testify without kneecaps." Feldman made a small sound. Dante looked at him. "Matteo, remove him before my wife saves his life twice." When they were alone, Elena turned on Dante. "Carlo built his claim on a lie." "Yes." "And the baby destroys it." "Yes." "Then he ordered the attack outside the hospital." Dante's face hardened. "Most likely." Elena touched her stomach instinctively. Dante saw the gesture. His entire posture changed. "He won't reach you." "You can't promise that." "I just did." "Dante, he took 11 years from me. He made me believe something about my own body that wasn't true. He built a succession plan around it. Then he tried to kill you before he even knew you were pregnant." His voice became very quiet. "Now he knows." Elena understood the implication. The safe house was no longer safe. They left 20 minutes later. The convoy took back roads toward Chicago beneath a gray morning sky. Elena sat beside Dante in the center SUV. His hand covered hers. Halfway south, the lead vehicle exploded. The blast threw Elena sideways. Dante caught her before her head struck the window. "Down!" Gunfire ripped across the road. Glass starred but held. The driver swerved. A second SUV appeared behind them, blocking retreat. "Ambush!" Matteo shouted through the radio. Dante pulled Elena onto the floorboards and covered her body with his. Bullets hammered the armored doors. "Stay down." "What about the baby?" "You're both staying down." The vehicle slammed into something. Elena screamed. Dante's arm protected her head. The SUV stopped. Then everything became noise, doors opening, men shouting. Gunshots in snow. Dante drew his pistol. "No," Elena said, grabbing him. "I have to get us out." "Then take me with you." His eyes locked on hers. He removed his coat, wrapped it around her, and opened the door. They ran behind a concrete barrier while guards returned fire. A bullet struck the barrier inches from Elena's face. Dante shoved her down and fired twice. A man fell near the tree line. Another shooter emerged on the opposite side. Elena saw him before Dante did. Left! Dante turned. The shot came first. Dante jerked. Elena's world stopped. Blood spread across his shoulder. Dante! He fired back, then staggered. Elena dragged him behind the barrier. It's through the shoulder, he said. I know. Her hands were already working. She pressed cloth to the wound. Dante looked past her, still tracking the fight. Elena, listen to me. If they break through, Matteo takes you. You do not wait for me. Shut up. Promise me. No. Elena, you don't get to tell me you're the one person I can't replace and then order me to leave you bleeding beside a highway. His eyes found hers. Even in pain, something warm flashed there. You remember everything I say when I'm stupid. Unfortunately, sirens approached in the distance. The attackers retreated. Within minutes, the road belonged to Valenti men and state police who had been bought, threatened, or both. Dante tried to stand. Elena pushed him back down. If you move, I will sedate you myself. With what? I am a nurse. I'll improvise. Matteo crouched nearby, blood on his cheek. Boss, I strongly recommend obedience. Dante glared at both of them. Elena almost laughed from relief. His thumb moved across her knuckles. There is something else, he said. The warmth disappeared. What? Feldman is dead. Elena stopped breathing. How? Poisoned in protective custody. Inside your security? Yes. Her skin turned cold. The traitor was close, very close. Dante looked toward the dark window. Carlo isn't working alone. The next betrayal came from someone Elena trusted. 3 days later, Sofia disappeared. Her bedroom window was open. Her phone lay shattered beneath the balcony. One guard had been found unconscious near the east gate. Dante was still in a sling when Matteo brought him the security footage. Elena stood behind them. At 1:17 a.m., Sofia walked voluntarily toward a side entrance. A familiar man waited outside, Luca Moretti. Elena felt the floor vanish beneath her. No. Dante's face went stone cold. Where is your brother? I don't know. Call him. She did. No answer. Again. Nothing. Dante took the phone from her hand. Matteo, find him. Elena stepped in front of him. Don't hurt Luca. His eyes hardened. If he handed my sister to Carlo, we don't know that. He walked her out of my house at 1 a.m. Then find out why. Move. Dante, look at me. He did. You trusted me when the facts made me look guilty. Trust me now when the facts make Luca look guilty. The words hit him. For several seconds neither moved. Then Dante looked at Matteo. Bring Luca alive. And Sofia? Dante's voice lowered. Bring her home. They found Luca 6 hours later in an abandoned church on the west side. He was tied to a radiator with blood on his face. Sofia was not there. Elena rushed to him. Luca! He opened one swollen eye. Dante remained near the altar, gun in hand. Where is my sister? Luca coughed. Carlo has her. Elena cut the rope. Why were you with her? Luca looked ashamed. She called me. She found something in her dad's old records. She didn't trust anyone at the house. She wanted to show me because I'm outside the family. We were supposed to meet at a coffee shop. Men grabbed us in the alley. Dante's jaw clenched. What did she find? Luca looked at him. Your father's original trust documents. Carlo was never supposed to inherit anything, not even if you died without children. Dante went still. Who was? Luca swallowed. Sofia. Elena understood immediately. Carlo's plan had never only been about Dante's infertility. Even if Dante had no child, Sofia still stood between Adrian and control of the Valenti Empire. "He needs both of them gone," Elena whispered. Dante looked at her stomach. "3 of you." A phone rang on the church altar. Every person froze. It was an old landline. Dante approached and answered. Carlo's voice filled the silent church through the speaker. "Nephew." Dante's face became empty. "Where is Sofia?" "Safe for the moment." "If you touched her—" "You always were dramatic where women were concerned. Your father had the same weakness." Elena saw Dante's fingers tighten around the receiver. Carlo continued, "Bring Elena to the old casino on Harbor Street tonight. Come alone. I give you Sofia." Dante laughed quietly. "You think I'm stupid?" "No, I think you're in love. It's much more useful." The line went dead. Dante put down the phone. "We're not going," he said. Elena stared at him. "Your sister is there." "Exactly." "Dante, no. Carlo wants me because of the baby. He wants you dead." "Then use that." His eyes turned dangerous. "Do not finish that sentence. Use me as bait." "No." "You said I wasn't weak." "You aren't." "Then stop treating me like glass." He crossed the church in 3 strides. "You are 6 weeks pregnant, and a man who has already ordered 2 attacks wants your bloodline erased. I am not taking you into a casino full of gunmen to prove a philosophical point about your independence." Elena lifted her chin. "Then what is your plan?" "Burn the casino down around him." "With Sofia inside?" His silence answered. He did not have a plan yet. Elena lowered her voice. "Carlo thinks loving me makes you predictable." Dante stared at her. "So be unpredictable." The old casino had closed 8 years earlier. Its neon sign no longer worked. Snow blew across a cracked parking lot beside the river. Broken windows stared over dark water. At 11 that night, Elena arrived in the back seat of a black sedan. Alone, as far as Carlo could see. She wore a long black coat over body armor. A microphone was taped beneath her collar. Dante had argued until the final second. Then he had done what he always did when fear became unbearable. He planned every possible way to kill the threat. Snipers watched from 2 rooftops. Matteo's team entered through storm tunnels beneath the building. Dante waited in darkness inside the abandoned hotel across the street. Elena could hear his breathing through the earpiece. "If anything feels wrong, you walk out," he said. "Everything feels wrong." "Then walk out now." "Not helpful." "Elena." She paused at the casino doors. "What?" A long silence. "Come back to me." Her eyes burned. "I will." She entered. Dust covered the marble floor. Old chandeliers hung above empty gaming tables. A few emergency lights cast red shadows across the room. Carlo stood near the center with 6 armed men. Sofia sat tied to a chair beside him. Her lip was split, but she was alive. "Elena," Sofia breathed. Carlo smiled. "The miracle mother." Elena kept walking. "Let her go." "You came alone?" "You asked nicely." Carlo laughed. "I see why Dante likes you." "Where's Adrian?" Carlo's smile thinned. "My son lacks the stomach for necessary things." "Maybe that makes him smarter than you." "Careful." Elena stopped 10 feet away. "You falsified Dante's medical tests." Carlo's expression barely changed. "Did Feldman tell you that before his unfortunate heart failure?" "You poisoned him." "He became inconvenient." Elena's pulse hammered. "And the attacks?" "The first was a warning. The second should have solved the problem." In her ear, Dante inhaled slowly. She knew he was fighting the urge to enter. Elena continued, "Why not kill Dante?" Carlo smiled. Because martyrs are troublesome. Better to weaken a king until his own men replace him. First, make him barren, then give him a wife he cannot control. Then let that wife become a scandal. You didn't plan the pregnancy. For the first time, anger flashed across Carlo's face. No, that's what ruined everything. For me, perhaps. For you, certainly. He raised his gun. Dante's voice exploded in Elena's earpiece. Down! The lights died. Gunfire erupted. Elena dropped behind a roulette table. Sophia screamed. Windows shattered as sniper fire hit two of Carlo's men. Matteo's team burst through a side corridor. Chaos filled the casino. Elena crawled toward Sophia. A gunman grabbed her coat. She slammed her elbow backward, tore free, and ran. Then Carlo appeared in front of her. His gun pointed directly at her stomach. Everything stopped. "Dante!" Carlo shouted into the darkness. "Come out or your heir dies first!" Elena's blood froze. A shape moved between the gaming tables. Dante stepped into the red emergency light. His pistol hung low at his side. "Let her go." Carlo smiled. "Put down the gun." Dante did. Elena stared at him. The most feared man in Chicago set his weapon on the floor because a gun was pointed at her. Carlo laughed softly. "There it is, your father's weakness." Dante's eyes stayed on Elena. "No," he said. "My father's mistake was believing love made him weak." Carlo's smile faltered. Dante looked past him. "Adrian." A gunshot cracked. Carlo jerked. His weapon fell. Adrian stood behind him with smoke rising from a pistol. Carlo looked at his son in disbelief. "You—" Adrian's face was white. "You told me Dante had stolen what belonged to us. You never told me you were killing Sophia." Carlo fell to his knees. Dante crossed the distance and kicked the gun away. Elena ran to Sophia. Matteo cut her restraints. Carlo coughed, blood spreading across his shirt. He looked up at Dante. "Finish it." Dante stood over him. Years of betrayal lived in that silence. The false diagnosis, the succession war, the attacks, Sophia's kidnapping, the gun aimed at Elena's unborn child. Dante picked up his pistol. Elena watched his face. "Dante." He did not look at her. "He deserves it," she said. Carlo smiled weakly. Then Elena continued, "But don't do it because he made you afraid." Dante's eyes shifted toward her. "Do it if it's what your world requires, not because he proved you could love something." The room went silent. Dante looked down at Carlo. Then he handed the gun to Matteo. "Call the federal contact. Give them the files, the accounts, the murders, everything Carlo touched." Carlo stared at him. "You would hand family to the government?" Dante crouched. "You stopped being family when you aimed a gun at my wife." Carlo's face collapsed. For him, prison was worse than death. Dante knew it. That was why he chose it. Outside, snow fell over the river. Elena stood beneath the broken casino sign while paramedics checked Sophia. Dante came toward her. Blood marked his sleeve, though none was his. For a second, they only looked at each other. Then he dropped to his knees in the snow. Elena's breath caught. The most feared mafia boss in Chicago placed both hands gently over her coat, exactly where their child rested beneath layers of fabric. "Are you hurt?" "No." "The baby?" "I don't know." His face went pale. Elena touched his cheek. "Claire will check." Dante pressed his forehead against her stomach. Armed men stood around them. Police lights flashed against the river. Snow collected in his dark hair. He did not care who saw. "Never again," he whispered. "We agreed to the plan together. Never again. You can't control everything." He looked up. "Watch me try." Elena laughed through tears. Then she pulled him to his feet and kissed him beneath the broken neon lights. The baby was fine. So was Sophia. Carlo survived long enough to face federal charges for murder, kidnapping, racketeering, and conspiracy. Adrian testified against him and left Chicago. The captains who had spent years whispering that Dante Valenti had no future suddenly remembered how loyal they had always been. Dante remembered every name. Elena returned to St. Catherine's once Dr. Mason cleared her, although she and Dante negotiated her schedule like two hostile governments drafting a treaty. She worked fewer hours. His guards stopped wearing suits inside the hospital because they frightened patients. One of them spent an entire afternoon pretending to repair the same vending machine. At 5 months, Elena found Dante alone in his office after midnight. "You missed dinner," she said. He looked up. "You were sleeping." "That has never stopped you from staring at me until I wake up." "I don't do that." The baby kicked. Elena froze, then smiled. She took Dante's hand and pressed his palm against the curve of her stomach. Another kick. The feared boss of the Valenti family went completely silent. "Again," he whispered, "I don't control her." "Her?" Elena smiled wider. "Claire called. It's a girl." Dante stared at her stomach as if the world had shifted under his feet. "A daughter. A very active one." He lowered his head and kissed the place beneath his hand. That was when Elena knew the man who had once treated love like a weakness had already surrendered to it. 2 months later, she walked into a newly finished nursery and found a hand-carved crib, shelves of children's books, a rocking chair beside the window, and enough hidden security technology to protect a president. "You said there would never be a nursery," Elena murmured. Dante stood behind her. "That was before there was someone to put in it." She turned. "I want to change our agreement." His face went still. "You want to leave?" There it was, the fear he could hide from gunmen but never quite hide from her. "No, I want to remove the expiration date." Dante stared at her for several seconds, then reached into his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box. Elena blinked. "Why do you already have a ring?" "Because I was trying to decide how to ask my own wife to marry me." She laughed through sudden tears. Dante went down on one knee. "The first time you married me because I gave you no good way out," he said. "This time I want an answer you are free to give. Stay because you choose me." Elena held out her hand. "Yes." Their daughter, Isabella Grace Valenti, was born during a September thunderstorm. Dante stood beside Elena through every hour of labor and looked more frightened holding a 7-pound baby than he ever had under gunfire. When Isabella curled tiny fingers around his index finger, he whispered, "Hello," and something in his face changed forever. 6 months later, Elena walked through St. Michael's again. There were still black SUVs outside. There were still armed men under the stone saints. But there was no debt, no contract, no uncle deciding her future. Dante waited at the altar. This time he smiled when she reached him. "You're shaking," he murmured. Elena squeezed his hand. "So are you." Cold church. Liar. When it was her turn to speak, she looked at the man she had once believed was a prison sentence. "The first time I married you, I thought freedom meant getting away from you. Then I learned freedom is being able to choose what you love even when it scares you. So this time, Dante Valenti, you're stuck with me because I said so." His mouth curved. "That sounded like an order." "You're learning." He kissed her while rain tapped against the stained glass windows, and Isabella slept in Sophia's arms. Years later, the Valenti household still told the story of the breakfast when Elena's morning sickness made 12 armed men reach for their guns. Everyone had believed the pregnancy would destroy Dante Valenti. Instead, it exposed the lie that had controlled him for more than a decade, revealed the traitor inside his family, ended a succession war, and gave the coldest man in Chicago the one thing he had built his entire life, believing he could never have: a family. And beneath all the contracts, threats, armored cars, old bloodlines, and violence, that became the truth no one in Dante's world could deny. Elena had been forced into the first wedding, but everything that mattered after it was chosen.